Is Starling Marte set to become the New York Mets opening day center fielder in 2023? We will discuss that on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, we still have a slow-moving hot stove at the moment. Not a lot happening. We got the winter meetings upon us soon, and things might start to trickle in, and one of those could be Brandon Nimmo signing with a different team. We haven't seen a ton of reports, but here's what we know. Widespread interest around baseball in Brandon Nimmo. He's the only bona fide starting center fielder on the market. Cody Bellinger maybe joins him in that class due to his high floor with his defense and the high upside he still presents as a former MVP. But no one's signing Cody Bellinger thinking, yeah, this guy's solidifying center field for the next 5 years for us, or even being confident he'll be an above average hitter again in 2023. Nimmo's the guy. Now, with that, there's interest from a lot of teams. The price tag can go up and up and up, and it really does seem like the Mets are squarely focused on the starting pitching market. Whether that's a report that they'd love to have Chris Bassett back, or that they've met with Kodai Senga and Justin Verlander and Carlos Rodon via Zooms, whether that is Jacob deGrom and the ongoing saga there. It seems like the Mets are going to spend big this offseason, but it's going to be to grab two starters to plug into their rotation with Scherzer, with Carrasco, with David Peterson, and then you still have those depth guys, and that's what I think they want them to be in Tyler McGill, David Peterson, Joey Lucchesi, and more. So I think what we're heading towards here is a good chance that Brandon Nimmo's not coming back. And as we've already discussed a bunch, in free agency, if you don't sign Nimmo back, your options are limited. It's Bellinger, as I mentioned. It's Kevin Kiermaier. Not a lot else. There's not a lot on the market that the Mets can look towards and say that's the answer. So all of this leads to what has been the simplest solution that's been staring us in the face for a long time, really dating back to last offseason. Because I think if you really dug through the archives, there was probably a Locked On Mets podcast where I discussed why it made sense to keep Nimmo in center and to play Marte in right, and also why Marte could be back in center the following season. Because it wasn't about giving Nimmo the position long term in center field. It wasn't about having Marte fall into right field for the rest of his Mets tenure, because he still has 3 more years left on that 4-year deal. It was about the outfield construction with the 3 guys that you knew would be starting a majority of the time. Mark Canha, weak arm. Brandon Nimmo, weak arm. So if you wanted to have any form of a plus arm in right field, it had to be Starling Marte. But that does not mean that Marte can't play center field again, because he was a very good center fielder prior to signing with the Mets. And you look at all center fielders in baseball since 2018. Starling Marte 4th in F4 since that span. You have George Springer at 18 ahead of him, 18 wins. Marte 17.3. You have Ronald Acuna, 18.4, and then Mike Trout leading baseball, 28.6. He's obviously the best center fielder in baseball. Did that in less games than any of those other guys I mentioned. Nimmo's actually right behind Marte at a 16.5 F4. And granted, he played in 69 less games across that span, got 400 less plate appearances, did have a WRC plus 16 points higher. It's funny, I remember doing, I think it was prior to the either prior to the 2019 or the 2020 camp. I think it was prior to 2020. Doing a lot of shows when the Mets were interested in trading for Starling Marte. And there was those out there that floated the idea of trading Nimmo for Marte. And I was doing podcasts comparing the two, saying it didn't make sense because Nimmo can be better than Starling Marte, at least close to it. So why would you trade the player that was under control to acquire him? I never had any problem signing Starling Marte, and then once it became just about signing him last offseason, before we even got to the offseason, I was comparing him to Curtis Granderson and saying they should sign this guy to a 4-year deal. They did that. Now you have him. What we saw with Curtis Granderson in his Mets tenure, there was times he played right, and then 2016, after they went to the World Series, you might remember he played center because they brought in Jay Bruce. That is what Marte does for you. He gives you that flexibility to be able to play him in any spot. The only thing that is a little bit different is we did hear this year that Starling Marte likes to be in one position for a season. He likes to be locked into a spot in the lineup and a spot out in the field. Now, if he had to be moved around, I'm sure he'll be a good team player, but I think Buck Showalter wants to lock him into one of center or right. And the way things are trending, I am leaning about 70-30, if not 80-20, that Starling Marte will be the starting center fielder for the New York Mets next year. And I think that is perfectly okay, and I think that's really smart if you can't bring Nimmo back. And what we're going to do in the next segment is we're going to look at the trade targets, because if you can't sign anyone to replace a Nimmo, which you just can't, there's no one in the market that's close to it. You know, we've spoken about it. Bellinger, the only guy that you would sign and say you're a starting center fielder until you prove you can't be. And if they want a lean defense, it'd be Kiermaier. So you can't address it through free agency. Maybe you can address it through trade. Otherwise, it has to be Marte. And then it's just about plugging right field, which is so much easier to do than plugging center. Because you know what? Jeff McNeil can be your right fielder. If you wanted to, you can go out and you can sign a handful of guys that I spoke about on yesterday's show to be that right fielder. Hell, you can even trade for a right fielder easier than you can trade for a center fielder. And that will be clearer in just a minute, because I'm going to dive into the few trade candidates that are on the board and why overall it's just not realistic to expect the Mets to go that way. Before we get to that, though, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball to soccer and esports. They've got it all at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. BetOnline is always the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports. You can also find things like, free agent odds. Justin Verlander, plus 375 to join the Mets this season. If you want to bet on that, head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action. Bet online, where the game starts. If the New York Mets were to make a trade to address center field, who is even available? Well, I think there's one school of thought, and that would be making the Brandon Marsh trade. And that's not to acquire Brandon Marsh. I'm speaking of the trade that the Phillies made at the deadline to get him. That is finding that player out there who has struggled, who could use a change of scenery, who can play a good defensive center field, that you have that backbone that you say, all right, no matter what, we're getting a good glove out there, and you probably have good control over that player, and you're hoping that with a tweak here and there with your hitting coaches, you can unlock something. There's a couple of guys that fit that bill. One we've seen for a long time, and I would highly doubt that he'll give you anything offensively, but he will give you an incredible glove in center field, and he's 25 still, despite being in the big leagues since 2017. It would cost next to nothing to acquire him, I believe, at this point. That's Victor Robles. You get him, you play him in center field, you hope that he ends up better. But look, the guy was in the first percentile in hard hit percentage, average exit velocity, expected WOBA, expected slugging. That means he made the worst contact pretty much of any hitter in baseball last year. So, yeah, not attractive. Christian Pache. Now, are the Athletics ready to give up on the 24-year-old that they just acquired? What was that, in the Olsen trade? He was the headliner. Luckily, they got Shea Langoliers in that deal as well, and he is now the headliner. Pache, I mean, the guy's been awful. He can't hit, hasn't hit. So far in his career, it's a 439 OPS at the big league level. Elite defensive center fielder, and that's why you trade for him. But he's right-handed, so that just gives you a third right-handed outfielder. Again, this is me trying to illustrate that there's just not a lot of good options, and I don't even know what it really would cost to get him. Alek Thomas. Now, this is probably the best option of all because he debuted this year. They have Corbin Carroll. They have Jake McCarthy, who had a really nice season. They have Dalton Varsho. They have a glut of outfielders in Arizona. Alek Thomas is a guy that you could acquire that has full control. He was a rookie this year. Again, I don't know how expensive that is because he's an unproven commodity with a 619 career OPS in his one season this year. Wasn't great. The outlying numbers didn't really jump off the page either. He didn't strike out a lot, so that's good, but didn't walk a lot either. Was good, though, defensively in center field. I'd like that as an option. You're almost buying a prospect that, was great, a second-round pick, 2018, and has a ton of promise, but someone that maybe is a little bit expendable for that team. And if you have the right package that they like, maybe because of what they have in place, although they do have the big first baseman was a Christian Walker, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if they would have that opening for a Mark Vientos at first base, or if that's a prospect that intrigues them as a DH, or even a third baseman that's bad defensively. I'm not saying that would be a 1-for-1, but maybe there's something there. Maybe they're watching Ronnie Mauricio tear the cover out the ball in the Dominican Winter League, and suddenly that's an option. But again, it's just not likely. So all of these trades pretty much don't make sense. You have Michael Taylor. That would be a deal that I don't think anyone would be happy with as far as him being your starting center fielder next year, but he does give you a great glove, and I think he had a strong first half. Looking at his complete numbers now, he must have faded pretty strong there in the second half because he was a great trade candidate. They held on to him. $4.5 million, will be a free agent after next season. I think you can get him pretty easily, but it's not a great replacement. I think Michael Taylor actually would be a fine, suitable fourth outfielder. I think that would be wise. And, if you maybe get an injury risk in there that's going to be your right fielder, or let's just say the Mets go out and they get Michael Brantley or they get Michael Conforto, one of these guys that you're just not entirely sure how often they're going to be out there. A Michael Taylor would be good to be a strong defensive outfielder that could get Marte off his feet, get a Brantley off his feet, Canna, whatever it may be. But the starting center fielder, no. So there's two guys, and they're the same two guys that have been on the market, the same two star center fielders that can be had, but teams are asking for an exorbitant price tag. It's Brian Reynolds and it's Cedric Mullins. You look at Reynolds, he's under control for 3 more seasons. Offensively, the guy's elite, a 281 hitter for his career, that is, 361 on base, 481 slugging. He has hit 24 home runs in 2021, 27 home runs in 2022, has been healthy and durable throughout his career so far. Can swipe an occasional base, walks at a good rate, gets on base at a good rate. The WRC plus this year, which measures hitters based on a league average of 100, was 125, 25% better than your league average hitter. A year prior, it was 141. You get him to a new environment where it's more about winning. You could see him play up a little bit more. The defense was terrible this year. That is worth mentioning. He was not good, graded out poorly in outs above average, graded out poorly in defensive runs saved, minus 14. He was minus 5 defensive runs saved in 2021. So not maybe the best center fielder. Let's look what his arm is like. The arm has graded out okay, maybe. I think you'd probably still keep him in center, and you just would hope that Canna and Marte would be enough around him. It'd be a big step back defensively, but offensively, he'd give you what you were getting with Nimmo. So that's, and maybe definitely with a little more pop in his bat. So I like Brian Reynolds as a fit, but I don't like the cost that it would take to trade for him, as opposed to putting the better center fielder out there in Marte, because I think Marte is absolutely a better defensive center fielder than Reynolds, and then addressing right field. And again, that could even be in trade. I think even in trade, I'm not going to, or I don't have any guys that I pulled up as right field trade targets, but even, you're trying to fill a corner. It's a lot easier to fill a corner than it is to fill center field. So that's not an option. Cedric Mullins makes some sense here. And I think what would be tough is, for one, the lack of track record. I mean, he was great in 2019. 291 hitter, 360 on base, 518 slugging, 136 WRC plus. Was a 30-30 guy, 30 home runs, 30 steals. He did swipe 34 bags this year. Only hit 16 bombs, though. On-base percentage dropped off to 318. Average dropped almost 40 points to 258. Slugging dropped 100 points to 403. WRC plus was 106. So a guy that has had one good season and then has been, first 3 years of his career, limited playing time, didn't play over 50 games in a season, but was never really grading out well. This year was still a 3.4 F4 player, still played 156 games, but just wasn't great. I think that he is expendable for that Baltimore team. I think they'd be open to dealing him, considering he is, a guy that's hitting arbitration. He's going to start to make some money here, and I think they'd be open with the right package. Now, what does that package look like? Are you giving up for a center fielder of now, a center fielder of the future, and Alex Ramirez? Does it have to get that high? Is it a Kevin Parada? Will they have Adley Rutschman, but maybe they like his bat? Is it Mark Vientos plus? Because I don't think that he is at all the type of headlining piece that'll get you a Mullins. Is it Mauricio Vientos, and is it also giving up a pitcher? I think they are a team that would probably love them some David Peterson, but then you're trading from an area you're trying to address to get him. All of this is to say it just costs so much to trade when you can sign a Haniger, a Conforto, a Brantley, a Gallo, any of these guys that you can stick in a corner that makes more sense than going out and swinging that trade for a center fielder. And again, are signing one of these guys. It's a really, really hard place the Mets have put themselves into. And I think they did a great job signing Canna and Marte in the sense that they were able to be ready for this, but they're still looking at a lot of bad options. So that gets me to this final segment. How can the Mets complement a Marte in center field next season? And I'm not just talking about who they can sign to play right. What's the long-term vision of Marte now over the life of this contract? We're going to get to that in just a minute. But first, another word from our sponsors. Starling Marte, the center fielder. Is this something that is exclusive to 2023? Do we see it beyond that? How does Mark Canha factor in? Well, the good thing is we saw Mark Canha can play some center. So I think what the goal would be, for one, if you're going to say, all right, Starling Marte is our center fielder, I think fourth outfielder becomes more important, because when Marte was your right fielder, you always knew that if anything happened to Nimmo, you could always make that switch. What happens if you lose Marte for a month now? I love Jake Mangum as a fourth outfielder on this team. I think that there's a great chance we see him at some point, assuming he doesn't get selected in the Rule 5 draft. I think at some point in 2023, Jake Mangum will have a Mets uniform. He'll be on the big league roster. But I'm less confident in him. Let's just say you re-sign Nimmo. I would be completely on board with doing nothing else to address the outfield. Maybe a minor league signing, your Albert Amora Jr. of the world. And then going into next season with Jake Mangum having a clear pathway to be that fourth outfielder. If Marte's your center fielder, now I think you have to be a little more cognizant of getting that fourth outfielder that is a real legitimate center field option. So maybe that is acquiring a Michael Taylor, like I mentioned before. Maybe It's a matter of signing a Haniger Conforto type to get that run in the outfield, but also letting them know they're going to play some DH and trying to get Kiermaier to be a high-priced fourth outfielder. Maybe he wants to start. Maybe he wants to win. That's the other type of thing. But I think whatever it is, whether it is signing somebody, making a trade for a guy that's in a contract here like a Taylor, I think that becomes more important to it. Just have a bona fide fourth outfielder. And then beyond that, I think what you do is you play out this season. Canna comes off the books. Marte then could be, slid right back into right field. Or he's your center fielder for the next 2 years, and he's your bridge to Alex Ramirez. I mean, he just turned 34, so you're looking at his age 34 and age 35 seasons. He can play center field for 2 more years. I feel confident in that. The only thing is you got to get him off his feet a bit. You got to DH him some. You just have to be really, really, really careful with him to get him through, because it's more strain on the body than playing right field. So I think Marte can be the bridge to Alex Ramirez, but the Mets have to be really looking around and seeing what's out there to see what center fielder might pry loose that they can either sign or trade. And you know what? Maybe that's just another reason to circle the wagons back around on a Bellinger as that type of an option, because maybe you get him into your building for a year with a contract. Maybe it's a 1+1 where the second year is more team friendly, and he can at least be the defensive anchor for you out there. Look, there's just not a lot of options. So the hope is Starling Marte is healthy next season and capable to give you 135 games starting in center field, and you only have to figure out 25 plus. And then let's just sign a really good right fielder that can fill that gap. But I think that's where we're heading for sure. Like I said earlier in the show, I'm about 80% feeling like Marte is going to be the center fielder next year. But that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. Tomorrow's show, I want to do something a little bit different. What would a homegrown lineup look like in 2025? If everything broke right for the prospects, how could the Mets fill out a roster without doing anything long-term in free agency or in the trade market over the next 2 years? We'll discuss that. Make sure you follow, rate, and review to catch that episode. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today, hosted by Peter Bukowski. This is where you want to go to stay up to date with everything going on in the sports world. You can follow Locked On Sports Today on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts.